Hello everyone, and welcome back to Making a Home. At the back of our garden is this brick building, and the plan has always been that this would eventually become my music studio / home office. But unfortunately, when we moved in, it was clear that this building was in a pretty bad shape.
Oh God. Oh yeah.
What was the smell?
Not too bad. Oh yeah, actually it does smell. Oh, it's very damp in here.
That's annoying.
That is very annoying, but we knew that would happen.
Yeah.
As is that.
That'll be why it smells damp.
Oh, that's grim.
And that looks like that's actually mould. Look on the side.
Oh yeah, I think you're right. Let's just do that at least. I mean, this door would fall down with a push anyway.
Apart from all the rubbish left behind by the previous owner, the roof was also full of leaks, and as a result, the whole space was literally dripping with damp. The reason the roof leaked was because someone had piled a bunch of metal and timber on the top, which had ripped holes in the felt lining. But in fact, the whole roof structure was very poorly built, so we decided that the best thing to do was to remove it and replace it completely. To begin with, we just covered the roof with a tarpaulin. This gave the space a chance to dry out a bit and bought us some time to clear out all the rubbish. But there was also another problem. The original roof was built with a slope towards the back of the property. To the rear of this is a concrete access path which runs behind all of the properties in our row. The problem was that the rainwater running off the back of the roof would collect in large puddles on the concrete behind the building, and this was causing constant damp issues on the back wall. So to solve this, the new roof would need to slope towards the front. This would also allow us to collect rainwater off the roof to use in the garden. Now that the roof wasn't leaking anymore, the next job was to clear out all the rubbish left in the room by the previous owner. One particularly nasty item was this plastic box, which was completely full of rancid water and rotting debris. It was so heavy that we couldn't even lift it off the shelf. So we drilled a hole in it instead and waited for the water to drain out. The smell was indescribably bad. Not just rot, but some other hideous odors as well. When we'd finally extracted all of the water and tipped the contents into the skip, there were a bunch of old rotten photos in there, amongst other things, which I think was probably why it smelled so bad. Anyway, we proceeded with removing all of the Heath Robinson shelving and other random junk, filling an entire skip full of rubbish. And after a lot of work, we finally got the room back to an empty shell. So at this point, the project got put on hold. We had other matters occupying our attention in the house, and money was tight. So for the next year and a half, we basically just used the building as a storage shed. We did put a new door on, but it was just a cheap internal one, and although we applied many coats of varnish, it didn't manage to hold up to the elements. We did also have to replace the tarpaulin since the original one started leaking after the first winter. But by the beginning of summer 2023, we were finally ready to start work on the new roof. Step one was to remove all the stuff we'd put in there over the previous year and try and find new places to store it all. This included some insulation for under the floor, which we got free from our friend Pete, and a bunch of wooden battens for refinishing our fence, which we got free from our friend Morgan. Yay for free things! The insulation was pretty bulky, so I cut it down into strips which will eventually fit between each of the floor joists. I could then manhandle them up into our loft to store until I'm ready for them later. Once the building was cleared out, my friend Logan and I started stripping off the old roof. After removing the tarpaulin over the top, we could then start pulling off the old felt covering and roof deck. This was in very poor shape, with a lot of it being quite badly rotted. There were a few occasions where we nearly put a foot through it. Surprisingly though, the underlying roof timber was mostly still solid, but there were a few spongy places. Nevertheless, all of it was chopped up and carted off to the local recycling centre. With the old roof now out of the way, it was time to start the long process of building the new roof structure. I'd never tackled anything quite as complex as this before, so I was understandably a little nervous about it. But I started by drawing up a plan on Sketchup. This helped me visualize how it would all fit together, and it also helped me solve a few problems, such as the annoying fact that every wall was a different height. Once I'd figured out the structure, I could then work out what timber I needed. Wherever possible, I bought longer lengths which I could then divide up into several shorter pieces, to try and reduce wastage as much as possible. A couple of weeks later, the timber had arrived, and I took some time off work to make a start on the build. The first step was to install the back and front wall plates. These serve two purposes. The first is to provide a fixing point for the roof joists and to allow the roof structure to be tied to the walls using wall straps. The second purpose is to provide a way to get the walls to a consistent height, since, as I mentioned earlier, they were all different. The rear plate is taller to allow for the lower wall height, and also for the new slope of the roof towards the front of the building. For both plates, I bolted two 2-inch timbers together for extra strength. Next, I installed the plates on the side walls. These don't hold any weight directly, but they do help to add rigidity to the structure. On the left side, I layered up two 2x4 timbers, since this wall was a bit lower than the other side. The right-hand side wall was more problematic. For some reason, on this side, the builders had installed a line of bricks on top of the blocks, with a slope towards the back of the building. So first I had to add a concrete topper to the wall to level it back out again. I cut up some OSB boards and clamped them to the wall to make a mold, which I then filled with concrete. I then had to wait a few days for this to cure, so in the meantime I moved on with some other tasks before returning later to fit the 2x4 wall plate. On the back wall, I installed an additional riser on top of the wall plate. This was to give the minimum fall needed for water to run off the front of the roof. I was initially planning to install this timber on its long edge, but I realized that this would have taken the total building height over 2.5 meters, which is the maximum height allowed in the UK without needing planning permission. So I installed the timber on its short edge instead. This made the roof pitch slightly shallower as a result, but still more than the minimum required for a rubber roof. So now I could move ahead with installing the main roof joists. This was relatively straightforward. For these, I used 6x2 timbers, which I trimmed down to size with a chop saw. I then attached them to the front and back wall plates using heavy-duty 150mm screws, inserted diagonally from the left and the right, and up from the bottom. Once the joists were attached, the next job was to add noggins in between them. I first added a line of them on each end, above the wall plates. Then I added another line down the center. I offset these so that a single rockwool insulation slab would fit in the longer gap on each one. On each end of the joists, I installed an end plate. This serves two purposes. Firstly, it provides a fixing point for the edge of the roof deck and also for the rubber roof trims. And it also just finishes the roof aesthetically and provides some weather protection for the roof space. Before moving on to the roof deck, I added some pointing between the wall plates and the top of the walls, just to neaten things up a bit and provide a bit more weather protection. Now I could move on to laying the roof deck. For this, I used 18mm tongue and groove OSB boards. These provide a solid base for the rubber roof sheeting to be laid over. This new roof structure is very solid now, and it doesn't move at all when I walk or even jump on it. Fitting the boards was a relatively straightforward process, and it was made much easier by using tongue and groove boards, so they slotted together neatly. The final step was to install the rubber roof sheet. This was quite a fiddly job, and I was grateful for the help of my mate Logan. I think trying to do this on your own would be pretty tough, especially if, like me, you don't really know what you're doing. The first step was to lay the roof sheet out and let it settle for a couple of hours. This allows it to expand and helps to remove any creases. In the meantime, we installed an overhang on the front side of the roof, which will form a drip line for channeling water into the gutter. For this edge, we installed a trim piece which goes under the rubber layer, and then there's a second piece which is fitted over the top after the rubber has been laid. Next was the rather nerve-wracking step of gluing the rubber sheet onto the roof deck. Once you stick the rubber down, there's no going back, so you have to make sure you do it right first time. We rolled back half of the sheet and then added the adhesive to the roof deck using a roller. This adhesive is horribly sticky and it gets on everything, no matter how hard you try. It took me 2 days to wash it off my hands afterwards. Definitely best to use gloves. Don't be like me. Once the adhesive was laid down, we then rolled the rubber back over the top of it. We then used a broom to brush out any air bubbles trapped underneath. Then we just repeated the process for the other side. One thing we realized was that the adhesive stays tacky for quite some time after being laid, so you do have a reasonable amount of time to get the rubber laid down properly. In fact, there were a couple of times where we caused some rucks in the rubber by walking on it before it was stuck down firmly, causing it to move slightly under our feet. Once the rubber was in place, we then went round and installed the trim pieces around all of the edges. These help to hold the roof sheet in place and also prevent water from dripping off the sides where there isn't a gutter. These are tacked onto the roof timber with special trim nails, so we needed a rubber mallet here to prevent the plastic caps on them from being damaged when hammering them in. The final step was to trim off the excess rubber with a Stanley knife. And there we have it, a new completed roof for the studio. I've since added a gutter along the front and also soffit boards under the overhang. Later, I'll be adding rock wool insulation between the joists, as well as acoustic plasterboard ceiling to try and make the space as soundproof as possible. So the next phase of this build will be installing all of the internal timberwork for the floors, and also the inner walls, which will be lined with rock wool insulation. I'll also need to run power out to the building and install a ventilation system with a baffle on it to minimize sound leakage. All in all, I'm only really about halfway at this point. But nevertheless, it's still very satisfying to have a fully completed roof on the building, and it's way better than the original one was. Once this is done, it should make a great space to use as an office/music studio. So stay tuned for the next installment. And I'll also be putting out another video shortly to cover some of the other projects we've done this summer. We've been busy. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.